I'm Korean.
So, almost at the end of 3 very busy, very packed days, and I'm sure you're all feeling pretty exhausted. But we'd like to have a little wrap-up session where we get comments and responses from you to what you've been hearing over the past 3 days. This is, as I mentioned earlier, coming to the end of a project, but most of us will be going on developing various aspects of the things we've been looking at over the last 5 years, and I think we've got some fantastic inspiration and thoughts from what the various speakers have talked about over the past days, but we love to sort of wrap that up a bit and get your further thoughts on where we can go in the future and how we can keep in touch and keep on exchanging ideas. So we're going to start off with 2 people, giving us some of their thoughts and feedback. It was originally going to be 3, but the third person, Paul Darcy, unfortunately is desperately overworked, so he couldn't manage to be here. So one of the first of the speakers is Yonjae, who is Associate Professor at the University of Hokkaido, and we have had a lot of collaboration and contact with Yonjae. He very kindly invited myself and 2 other people on the project to Hokkaido the year before last, and we've been collaborating in all sorts of ways. And he has been here in Canberra for a year and is leaving tomorrow, very sadly. And the second speaker is Ben Habib, who has come up from Melbourne, who has a very interesting mix of research interests, and I think going beyond research to various sorts of activism. He's worked a lot on North Korea, but also on issues of sustainability and organic farming and those sorts of topics. So a very appropriate person to help with that discussion. So they will just speak relatively briefly about some of their thoughts from the conference, and then it's completely open to anything really, within reason, that you'd like to say, ask, or discuss. Thanks.
Can you post?
It's great to be at the end of the conference and just be able to freestyle and not have to have anything too complicated prepared. As Tessa said, I come to this gathering with a unique set of lenses that I've looked upon this conference with. It's been absolutely fascinating to observe the work that's being done by all the presenters here and to chat with everyone else who's been involved. So yes, I've done a lot of work in the past on North Korea. Nuclear weapons doesn't really qualify as living politics, as Robert pointed out this morning. But I've also done a lot of work on global climate politics, and more recently moving into work on environment movements, and specifically the international permaculture movement, which has a lot of resonance with a lot of the grassroots organic ag projects that have been talked about at this event. And I'm also a permaculture practitioner, and I teach permaculture at Ceres Community Environment Park down in Melbourne. So that's my side hustle outside of academia. And teach environmental politics at La Trobe as well. I guess with my international relations hat on, I'm looking at the broader perspective of what we've looked at here. I'm interested in the broader context, and I'm interested in what the living politics case studies might represent within that broader context. So that's the approach I'm taking here. Like many of you here, I come from the politics is everything school of thought. I see politics as the inevitable social dynamic that emerges from interactions between human beings, from the individual level right up to larger scales of collective entities. And looking upon that, to think that you could break off a small chunk, and that being institutional politics, and just think that's politics, strikes me as disingenuous and reductionist. I see all levels of politics as interrelated and interdependent in a dynamic system. And here my influence is from complex systems theory, so that's something that I've become interested in over time. So with that in mind, I've been mulling over 3 broad themes as I've watched the wonderful presentations over the last 3 days. And the first theme relates to global transition and the emergence of new isms. So this is something that I've been mulling over, particularly in the permaculture space over the last few years. So what do I mean by this global transition? Well, let's consider the historic moment we're living in at this time. I contend that we're living in a moment of transition that's of a similar scale to what we saw with the Industrial Revolution 200 years ago. A similar scale and breadth, with all of the shifting patterns of power relationships and conflicts and ferment on the ground filtering up all the way through the system of politics right to the top. And part of that is the momentum of change that's been brought about in the global energy system with the changing energy mix away from fossil fuels. So if we look back to the Industrial Revolution, it was the move to fossil fuels that really underpinned all of the material changes in society and the economy at that time. We're changing the energy mix now, therefore we're changing the structures of consumption, production and exchange that flow from that, and therefore the political relationships that flow from there. We've got the internet that's networked people globally in unprecedented ways. We've got AI coming onto the scene, both of those for good and for ill, depending on where you sit. We've got large hierarchical institutions of which we're all members of various kinds. They're starting to hit the wall because that large model of vertically stratified organisational structures that were useful for solving problems in the 19th and 20th centuries are beginning to be not so useful at solving 21st century problems. So I do see an emerging imperative for decentralisation and horizontal organisational structures. And the kind of projects that we've seen in this conference are some examples of that starting to come to fruition. I don't want to overplay the extent to which this has evolved to date, but it is something that I see starting to emerge and starting to proliferate more as we move forward. We're also confronted by existential threats from climate change and other forms of environmental degradation, and we've seen a lot of our living politics case studies addressing some of those environmental issues in the East Asian context. And they are really serious in the East Asian context. So one of the things I do at La Trobe University is run an environment sustainability study tour for undergrads. And we go to China and we go to Korea, etc., to see the scale of these environmental problems and also the excellent innovations that are taking place in these societies that we can learn from back here, because Australia is well behind the pack when it comes to addressing environmental harms. So, with all that context in mind, my feeling is that the settled assumptions of the last 2 centuries are now up for grabs again. The new isms that will shape the next 200 years are taking shape right now. So we're slap in the middle of this. And the kind of living politics going on at the grassroots level that we're involved with and we've been analysing here, this is in the thick of the development of these new isms and the development of the new society. These micro-projects are expressions of these changes that are taking place. These are green shoots that are emerging from the compost, if you like, of the old order that's grown up from the 19th and 20th centuries. And these green shoots are sprouting up without permission and often in conflict with existing structures of power. So that makes these green shoots a very interesting thing to analyse from a political perspective, and also dangerous and difficult to be a part of if you're trying to forge something new. All right, theme number 2 builds on this, is that we've got laboratories for emerging modes of exchange and social organisation. The kind of living politics case studies that we've looked at, these are the laboratories for these new isms and new modes of exchange. Now, on the way here yesterday, Davina and I were talking about whether there was anything particularly novel or new about the fact that there are these micro-level projects bubbling up. And of course, they are happening all the time. That's how societies change and evolve and exist. What's interesting now is the importance of these living politics micro-projects, the importance that they take on in the context of these larger meta changes that are happening at a larger level. Now, if you're serious about ecological sustainability, as I'm sure all of us are in this room, you can't live and embody your politics without connection to place and an understanding of the interconnection with the environment. So First Nations peoples knew this and know this intrinsically, but this is something that Western societies need to relearn. This is something that's embodied in organic agriculture, as we've seen from some of the presentations here. Everything we do as living organisms is it inevitably consumes resources and produces waste products of one kind or another, and this directly relates to how we interact with everything around us. So when you talk about politics as everything, I think it relates to how we exist as living organisms and the impact we have on what's going on. So this politics of place, the politics of the everyday, is the politics of ecological sustainability, because it relates to this complex interdependence. And I would argue that's a major omission from strictly institutional interpretations of what is political and contests over control of the machinery of governance. If we think of the classic Harold Lasswell definition over who gets to decide who gets what, when and how, that's not enough. We need to bring in the grassroots into this equation. Place is more than just the stage on which the drama of politics is played. The earth is more than just a resource to be pillaged. But of course, it's easy to say that. It's harder to operationalise that within the context of the cultures and institutions that we live in. And the type of living politics case studies that we've looked at through the conference, are examples of how we're playing with how to operationalise these concepts. And just finally, the third theme I'd like to highlight is the role of academics within this broader context. What's the role of us as academics within the context of our historic moment, within the context of this great transition? And I really encourage all of us to ponder what it means personally for us to be academics at this particular time. What responsibilities do we have, not just to our students, not just to the people that fund us and our institutions, but to the broader society and the communities that we are part of. And is there anything different that we have to do in our practice as academics that fit this historic moment? What's our relationship to these emerging grassroots projects that we've been describing? Is this the moment for the scholar activist or the scholar practitioner? Personally, I think it is, and that academics can play a much greater role in being active participants in our great social project, rather than just observers and documenters. And I think when you're involved as an academic looking at grassroots politics, you kind of get drawn into that space naturally. And I think most of us here are probably in that activist or practitioner scholar space. There's a real place here for us to be link people. So UX culture brokers idea, that really resonated with me. To be a voice or a link for the less powerful. So the video work of Mikhail that we saw this morning was a great example of that. Or some of the other video documentary work that we've seen. Fantastic examples. And also, I think, our ability to communicate in accessible language. All of us here have been guilty of talking in academic jargon in ways that lay people cannot understand. And I think if we want to play this grander social role in this historic moment, we need to learn to communicate in ways that are accessible to everyone and not just a niche audience. So just to finish up on a positive note, I think this is an important historic moment. We as academics have a great responsibility to play an active role in this moment, and that's a responsibility and a privilege for us to embrace. And I think what I've seen here in this conference from all of us here, we're all doing that. So thank you and well done.
Okay, I just speak a bit loudly without the microphone, or can I borrow one?
Yeah, let me
Yeah.
your mic.
Only one's working.
Probably to both of you. It's half comment, half question. Since both of you positioned our concept of informal politics in a relatively huge historical change, and then that's very good. Makes me feeling a kind of responsibility and sense of have to do more things. In terms of engagement or practitioner activities in Australia, they have kind of an engagement Australia or sense of that kind of stuff. I just wonder if there anything like in Australia at the engagement Asia from the perspective of Australian academic or society.
Do we have another mic? I can project, it's all right. I mean, yes, there is a lot of grassroots engagement between Australia and various Asian countries, but there's also a lot of room for improvement. So one of my roles outside of academia in the permaculture space is, because I get to travel to Northeast Asia all the time and meet up with local practitioners, I can be a link person between like people in Korea and China and my permaculture colleagues back in Melbourne and back in Australia. And a lot of people in the permaculture movement, these are not people who have language abilities. They might not have even travelled to the region before, certainly don't have the cultural understandings that we would have, so they're not equipped to make those links. Whereas people like us, who do have those competencies and do have those connections, we can be those link people to be able to appeal to different audiences and to bring people together, because we sit on the fence between these different audiences and between different societies. So that's something that can be done more, I think, to build on the good work that's already been done in this space. And I'm talking about permaculture and environment, but I'm sure that kind of role would be a very suitable one in other areas as well.
Thank you. Can I add one more word?
Yeah, sure.
I'm very interested in that kind of links and being involved in or being connected to that kind of links if you have one, because personally I also want to do a similar thing, to link Australia to Asia or that kind of stuff. If you have some network, please add my link to your link.
Let's talk, yeah.
So, hello, I'm on now. Ben, I want to ask an awkward question here. So it seems to me that the kind of thing that you just presented is quite radical, but actually my feeling about the case studies that we've had are not radical, and some of them are intrinsically not intentionally not radical. Non-confrontational LGBT in Vietnam, for example, or Bong Yi-jae's case from the factory. I mean, these girls from the countryside, they're not going to storm the gates. You know, they're doing something else. So I wonder how you square that circle. So you were fitting these case studies into your narrative, but I don't quite see it.
Yeah, you're right. They don't all fit.
Okay.
And what my comments certainly say more about my worldview and what baggage I bring to the conference as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's true. I mean, just because people are practicing a type of survival and adaptation to their local conditions doesn't necessarily mean that they're actively and consciously trying to play a role in this broader force. But the fact is that this historic moment is there, and that's the context in which people are trying to get by and live their lives and do the best they can. So I guess if I would refine my point, it's that this broader historic moment is shaping the politics of everyday life, and this is the reality that people are adapting to as they try to survive, rather than as a purely activist vision.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. My question or comments, well, I came only today, but anyway, I'm very happy and thank you for this opportunity. So nomadic way of life, or the Mongolian nomadic way of life, probably is the only surviving way of life, nomadic way of life on Earth, which is self-sufficient, which has been always self-sufficient, which has been always environmentally friendly, which has been always good to human beings and both animals and the environment. And this modern development changes are affecting to this way of life enormously, especially the last 25 years. And in terms of the organic farmings, we believe that the nomadic way of life could provide the real organic food. For example, we have about 42 million livestock, and we just let them go to the pasture. All the herds move 4 times a year, looking for a good pasture for their animals, and then their animals would eat more than 500 different herbs and plants that grows under nature. And the disadvantage is we always need to move around. We can't really. We had a lackage of that organization. Well, back in socialist time, like 27 years ago, it was very well organized. Communal system, community organization was quite well. So what do you think of this nomadic way of living, and what we could do to help those nomadic people to survive in this modern world? Because we are losing more and more young people moving to the cities, and they are forgetting. They don't want to be herders anymore, and those problems are starting there. So, can you please, give us your opinion about this? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Do you want to have a go? Yeah, that's a big problem. Has anyone in here had to move away from their home for opportunity? Yeah, most of us probably have had to. I grew up in a country town in regional South Australia, and I had to move for education, for work. So I moved to Adelaide. Adelaide's still pretty small. For employment, when I was trained, I had to move elsewhere again. I think seems to be a normal process in the industrial age anyway. I don't really have an answer to your question. But if I put my permaculture hat back on, often there's an urge of people who have migrated who are living in urban areas and in the cities, who are so sick of working in big institutions that crush their soul, and living lifestyles that are not fulfilling and that are damaging to the environment. And the urge is to break away and run and get a block of land out in the country somewhere and drop out of society. And that's an understandable urge. It's also not possible for everyone who lives in an urban centre to do that. The idea is ludicrous. So one of the answers to I think, is for people who live in cities to start to do the kind of regeneration that Robert was talking about where we are in urban centres, and trying as much as we can to regenerate urban centres and make them as sustainable as possible, which is a mammoth task, but I think it's the task. We have to do it because of the existential crisis that we're in. So I think that need is driving a lot of innovation, and will continue to drive a lot of innovation. And that might have flow-on effects for people who live in rural and regional areas. So it doesn't really answer your question, but there's a related challenge there about this link between rural areas and urban areas. Do you want to say anything?
Just speaking to that, yeah, I think it's one of I see that as one of the sort of touchstones that could be solidarity between the kinds of things that people have presented on in this conference, which is that we live in an age that is very cruel to the nomad, and that even people who are living more settled and farming have to be able to move around so that the soils and so forth can regenerate and rest. But we have societies that are fixated on borders, and the world is increasingly bordered in terms of the freedom of movement of ordinary people, and the freedom of things is like gone crazy. Things are able to cross borders, like between India and Pakistan. You see truckloads of tomatoes and onions go through every day, and people still can't visit their families. And of course, with the community I'm working in, I mean, their world is completely bordered now. And one might say they're entirely free, and there is a mythology in Pakistan that these people are lifestyle gypsies. And it's true that their culture was and is semi-nomadic, but there's a lot of force applied to them now. To both move off, but not be able to move freely from their own will. So there's a sort of bundle of pressures on people to sort of be settled and pay taxes and buy things, and at the same time move in order to work, but there's no freedom to actually move through real choice. I don't think I'm articulating it very well, but I think that's the thing about the nomad is something that could be bringing people together more across cultures and within cultures, and that between cities and rural areas there could be, I think the understanding of the walls could sort of bring people more together. That would be interesting.
Okay, just a quick response to this, like moving around and settling, and so this clear binary between like migrants or people moving versus the sedentarists who are staying. And let's try not to make this boundary anymore. Not because I'm working on migration, but if you look at the history, we have been moving around so much historically, and so that like we tend to think that people just like a nation state, this community forming, and yes, and the sedentarist way of life has been so powerful and has been studied as a powerful in academic scholarship. But I look at my own life, and it's hardly ever quite sedentarist, I must say. And there are so many people who move around the world, and so sometimes it's like forced and sometimes like based on willingness, but that line itself is getting finer and finer and finer. So that like we need to look at both sides to be capture movement and have, including informal life politics, I suppose. So that like I would suggest that like not make a sort of like distinction between who move, who don't move. But just to kind of capture the ghost and then try to come up with some explanation.
To go on from that, this could, I mean, essentially this is one of the things I talked about earlier, is this could be a moment, a brief moment of bordering before a great deal of movement, you know, in the sense of if sea levels rise and, you know, global warming happens, we will see a lot of people on the move. And it won't just be from like the Middle East or from Africa to Europe, it will be from places in Europe to higher places in Europe. You know, in Britain, thinking about, you know, from movements of people from the sea to the uplands and to, you know, to avoid as much as possible being by the coast or by the river. You know what I mean? We could be at a brief moment of bordering before a great deal of like unbordering. Crazy way of saying it. A great deal of movement. You know, there will be more great movements of people, more great migrations, and they will be from different places, and, you know, there'll be internal and external. There'll be migrations away from more environmental crises as it gets more dramatic. So this is, you know, in a sense, it's a very bordered moment, and, you know, it could be that we end up in the sort of Michel Houellebecq's vision where the rich border themselves in spaces of like sustainable livability in their sort of domed cities, do you know what I mean? And the poor surround these cities, these places of money and life. You know, they all have extra longevity. You know, but I suspect, I would really hope it doesn't end up like that. I think it'll be a bit more haphazard than that. You know. Anyway, so history doesn't stop at this bordering moment. You know, with the fences up in Serbia and, you know, things like that. You know, it'll move on quite radically and quite quickly, I suspect.
I think we drift away from the original question here to me. You know, like nomadic people, their traditional way of life, but we have all over here. We are very fortunate. We can choose any lifestyle we want. You know, I also nomadic. I call myself as post-nomadic because I move away where the greener pasture or opportunity. But I have a choice and I have ability. But look at the refugee stuck in the, they don't have choice. And also, Mongolian nomadic people, even in Australia, politicians said, oh, Aboriginal way of life is a choice, lifestyle choice. Not, it isn't. You know, I think it somehow, I'm not criticizing. I think we are just delivering way too much reality of these people facing it. It's getting too romantic. As I saw in the cinema the last 2 days, you know, the people addressing a lot about the homeless and immigration, refugee, environmental degradation. But what I saw, they made up the material. If you don't go to the collection of the museum or private collection, where this enormous work is another environmental capital to me. So I was very mixed feeling about that, you know. But anyway, if I go mumbling too much.
No.
Thanks very much. I think there are two really interesting and slightly different issues for me that have come out of that bit of the discussion. I mean, one is about people who move or can't move, and one of the things that I've felt all along through the project is, on the whole, we have been looking at case studies that are in specific places that are not necessarily particularly related to migrants or migration. But I think that the whole notion of informal life politics is something that applies very much to the lives of migrants and refugees who are forced to organise their own ways of surviving because nobody else is going to do it for them. And I think that's one of the ways in which I like to continue thinking about this. But the other somewhat different question, going back to the nomadic way of life point, is I made a brief visit to Mongolia last year. I know very little about it really. But to me it was really eye-opening because it is a really different way of life and one that I hadn't come across before. And I think that another thing that can come out of this is that by getting people from very different ways of life in communication with one another, there are all sorts of things that we can learn. So, for example, Mitan's project is also really eye-opening because it's, again, something quite different from what most people here experience. And if we can somehow get those very different ways of life more in communication with one another, I think we've got such a lot to learn from one another. So, very. Don't go yet. Don't go yet.